Tonight is the first in our series of three, Curator's Choice. I can't even say the word, and I am the curator. So I'm Michael Bertolini, the curator, and tonight is the first of our three Curator's Choice evenings, and we are going to have a very interesting performance tonight from Dr. Hull, and we have our new president, Mark, that's going to talk to you for a few minutes about this.
Hello, welcome to the Historical Society, and I'd like to introduce my good friend, Dr. Richard Hull. And
you can call me Dick Hull.
I do. He's a professor at NYU, Fulbright scholar. He's the recipient of multiple teaching awards. He is the recipient of the Orange County
Revered
Citizen and Revered Citizen, and the Warwick Citizen of the Year last year.
Town historian.
Town historian. I forgot that one. I am super excited. Dick.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you, Mark. It's a real pleasure to be here. Actually, this is the first in a series of three. The first is this. The theme is Warwick at War and at Peace. And this is going to be Warwick, how Warwick mobilized for the First World War. The second one, coming up next month, we'll look at how Warwick mobilized for the Revolutionary War. And then the third will deal with how Warwick mobilized for globalization. How Warwick went out into the world and did good things, joining the Peace Corps, Doctors Without Borders, all kinds of organizations that went overseas into Asia and Africa and elsewhere, and coming back and further enriching their communities with their global experiences and raising our own awareness. So it's not just all about war, it's about, the series is about peace as well. And you know, I was just thinking as I was coming in today and looking at, if you can, spend a little time and look at some part of our exhibit, as much of our exhibit as you can, because we've got some interesting images and things to share. But this series, in a way, actually began 2 years ago when we did we had an event that involved remembrance of the Second World War. And Michael Bertolini and John Stage and Warren McFarlane, and oh, that's who it was, McConnell, Dr. McConnell, and am I missing anyone? And Bob Fletcher, all shared their experiences during the Second World War, and that was very exciting, very interesting, and insightful, and that was when the seed was planted in my mind that wouldn't it be interesting to look at the First World War, particularly now because we are celebrating this year the centennial of the outbreak of that war, and I thought that this would be a good time, September, to look at this. I'd like to thank a lot of people for helping me out in the research on this, sharing information, sharing material. I can think of Catherine Anders, who manages with the staff our tremendous archives that we have here. Without the archives, I don't know where we'd be in terms of any kind of historical research on our community. It's a really first-class archive, one of the best in New York State for an historical society of our size. One of the best, period, I would really say, actually. I want to thank Jim Baird, who donated the correspondence of a private Robert Putnam Benedict from an old family in Warwick who participated in that war and died. Was it the last day of the war, the day before the end of the war? And the last day of the war, and had a wonderful correspondence throughout his experience during the First World War. I want to. And that collection is in our archives now. Jim Baird donated those letters to the archives. I want to thank Frank Atkins as well. He has shared with me a wonderful pile of letters from First Lieutenant Welling, Randolph Welling, and some of those are over on the credenza. I also want to thank Terry Hahn, who shared some images with us of the Coates family and others that participated in the war, and John Stage, who shared some material, and Jean Beatty May, our village historian. And there are others as well, but those just immediately stand out in my own mind. So, World War I. Well, folks, as you probably know, we're at war again, as of last night. And it's a war that we don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know whether we're going to have ground troops at some point out there, and our young men and women will be put at grave danger once again. We don't know how many hundreds of billions of dollars this war might cost us, a national treasure. We'll have to make sacrifices in so many areas, not only our infrastructure, but education, medical, health care, all kinds of things. We are going into a war that we are going to have to mobilize for. And so I think this is maybe a particularly timely moment for us to talk about community mobilization in the face of a catastrophe, a potential catastrophe. Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I think there's a bit of truth in that. We are faced today with some of the same crises that earlier generations in Warwick faced. What are those crises? We are faced with the Middle East that is extremely unstable and violent. They were too. The Ottoman Empire was collapsing at that time. The Ottoman Empire had ruled over the Middle East, and there was uncertainty as to what was going to happen. We had extremist groups of assassins, terrorists, nihilists. Our President McKinley had been assassinated not long before that time. Our President Teddy Roosevelt, who succeeded him, was almost killed by an assassin's bullet. So we were faced with that, and government leaders in Europe were being assassinated by these terrorist groups. And we are faced with an epidemic that we don't know how to control. We have no cure for. It's an epidemic that could very easily mutate into a pandemic. And of course, I'm talking about Ebola today. And in those days, it was a form of influenza, H1N1 probably. And people knew very little about that at the time. But that would be threatening us in a sense, kind of conflicting with the war mobilization, and we'll be getting into that shortly. And tensions were clearly rising across Europe. Russia was undergoing a period of great leadership crisis and instability in 1914. Russia's having a lot of problems now deciding what role it should be playing in the world and in the future. And so we are living in a very uncertain period, a period of enormous complexity. This new campaign that has just been launched, there are allies who are at the same time expediting financial transactions to ISIS, to our enemy. We find ourselves with strange bedfellows as we go into this very, very uncertain new war. But there's no question about it, we are at war again in the United States. And so I will try to set my remarks tonight within the wider context of this. Well, until the last year or so, the American public had very little knowledge or understanding of the First World War and events leading up to it. But historians have taken a new interest. With 100 years now that have elapsed, we're taking a new interest, and especially an interest in the long-standing debate over who was to blame for this conflict. Was it Germany? Was it France? Was it Great Britain? Was it Russia? Perhaps Austria-Hungary? But was it really just incompetent, inept diplomats and statesmen? Was it because of the sudden onthrust of a new form of globalization. That's a possibility too. This was a war where communications could take place almost instantaneously through telegraph. And because messages were transferred so quickly and demands were made, we want answers immediately, diplomats could no longer sit down and have a drink and dinner and sleep overnight and think about something, let it ferment in their minds. They didn't have the luxury of time to negotiate, to think things out. And the world was shrinking because not only of telegraphic technologies, but other kinds of technologies, railroads and so forth. So it was a rapidly globalizing world that required new frameworks and new paradigms in which to devise and implement policies. And we are once again faced with a sudden spurt in globalization with the internet. Again, we have to make decisions very, very quickly, even faster than in 1914. But the internet is forcing us once again to develop still new paradigms in which to act. And so there are just so many interesting parallels here. Okay, so who was to blame for this? Well, there's a new school of thought now that is emerging that really these leaders were sleepwalkers. Most of the blame is now going to the statesmen, to the statesmen of all of the countries that I have mentioned, and including the United States. So it's not just simply the Germans were the bad guys, that they were the ones who should bear 100% responsibility for that horrible conflict. And in the last year, there's been an outpouring of very popular books, best-selling books that many of them have been written by distinguished scholars from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, all over the world. Books, monographs, articles. Some of them have received very favorable reviews, and some have even been winning very prestigious prizes. Now, the scale of World War I, World War I was unprecedented, as was the human cost. The war may have ended on November 11th, 1918, Armistice Day, as we call it. Yet World War I still haunts us because of the sheer scale of human carnage. This was a war of attrition. This was a war of tanks, of trenches, of submarines, of machine guns, of aircraft. Aircraft had never been used in a war, other than the Italian bombardment of North Africa one afternoon in 1911. That was really the beginning of air war. But it was really the First World War when actual fighting took place in the air itself. And submarines, of course, were new to war as well, although there were earlier antiquated experiments without during the Civil War. But it was really during the First World War that they came into very lethal use and effective use. This was a war, too, of poison gas, a war of caustic chemicals. And it was a war that, as a result, would bring about the collapse of regimes, of the Ottoman Empire, of the German Empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. One could go on. The world was clearly very, very different in the 2 or 3 decades following the war. But the U.S. rose. Many historians say that this was really the beginning of what we call the American century. America really came into its own. America became a world power at last. But we also saw, as a result of the war, the rise of communism in the form of the creation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the coming of Lenin and ultimately Stalin, and all of the great losses of human life as a result of the Sovietization of the former imperial Russia. But let's look at the human cost, and really in terms of people, of human beings. 65 million men had fought in that war. 8.5 million combatants were killed. 8 million went missing. 21 million were wounded physically. 4.8 million U.S. soldiers served in the First World War. And of this, 53,000 Americans died in battle in little over 16 months of our involvement in that war. And another 62,000 died from disease. And 230,000 were wounded. A lot of people. Now, what I've tried to do is to look at this war at the grassroots level. Most historians, in fact, almost all historians, look at the big picture, But I think to really understand the First World War, to really understand how people felt about it, their gut reaction, you have to zero in on villages and towns and read correspondence, read newspapers, and so forth. And so that is what I attempted to do in my own research. I'd looked at the big picture years ago. I had studied the war working on my master's degree at Columbia, and looked at the big theories about causation and so forth. But there were so many questions that were still in my mind that my professors were unable to answer. And so I took this opportunity about 8 months ago to begin to do some research on this at the Warwick level. And I came up with some really very interesting insights that I had not considered before I did this research. So it was by looking at letters that were written home by those who were at the battlefront, by looking at diaries, at memoirs, at news items, at photographs, at posters, as much material as I could possibly find around here in our community, from families, from archives like the Historical Society, the Wisner Public Library, to the help of Sue Gardner, who was, again, very useful in this project as well, in feeding me information. So I decided to focus on how we mobilized for war. And I saw that mobilization for war had as much, if not more, effect on our community than the combat aspect of the war itself. Of the 157 Orange County men who gave their lives in World War I, and it was called the Great War in those days, in the Great War, only 62 were actually killed in action. 74 died of diseases. 317 from Warwick were in the armed services, almost all in the American Expeditionary Force, not all, but a large number, and 7 died that we know of. Nevertheless, World War I slowly, quietly slipped from public memory as veterans died. And judging from newspaper stories, by 1930, 32, there was nothing about our veterans, nothing about the war, no reflections upon it, no lectures or anything. It had almost been forgotten, only to be slightly revived, I guess, when Memorial Park was laid out here in the village in the late 1930s. And the beautiful pine trees were planted in Memorial Park, where in memory of those who had fought not only in the mainly in the Great War, but in all wars. But other than that, it was just about forgotten. Now, though war broke out in Europe in August of 1914, we decided on neutrality, that is, the United States. Yet, for the next nearly 3 years, we exported overseas to Germany, but mainly to the United Kingdom, huge quantities of materiel. The economy of the United States prospered as a result of this. In fact, it was the greatest economic boom in our history. Like most wars, World War I affected patterns at home. Business profits grew. Factories expanded. I'm thinking of the Warwick Knife Factory. They were beginning to do a land office business. Industries were turning out small amounts of war goods throughout Orange County, from Newburgh across to Middletown to Port Jervis and north and south. Government authority would swell, and people began to expect different things of their government, particularly of their federal government. From 1914, our government would intervene in the American life, in American lives and American culture as never before. The outbreak of World War I in 1914, though, did come as a huge shock to us. It was on the front page of the Warwick Valley Dispatch on August 5th, 1914, and it also ran in the Warwick Advertiser. But the summer of 1914 in Warwick had been a quiet summer, a prosperous summer. Pretty good rainfall. The black dirt farmers were taking in a great crop after a number of bad experiences with flooding in years past, but they were beginning to do okay. The dairy farmers would do very well. The dairy farmers would even do better during the war, selling milk and milk products, butter especially, to the federal government and the companies exporting that overseas during the early periods of the war. But clearly no one in the United States, and certainly very few people in Warwick, wanted our country to get involved in that war thousands of miles away. Let them solve their own problems. We've got a wonderful grand ocean, a body of water that will buffer us. Let's make money. This is great. Our economy is booming. Let's just stay back, supply them with goods, and just hopefully things will finally work their way out in Europe. Okay, so the average Warwickian knew very little about Europe, and there were very few Americans in uniform. We're basically isolationists. We just love the nice, sweet, calm, bucolic life of our Warwick valleys. We didn't want any foreign entanglements. We didn't want any American boots on the ground, combat troops on the ground. Some in town would support emerging movements like the American Union Against Militarism and the League to Limit Armament. These were two national movements, and they picked up, I know, some members here in Warwick, but not a lot. Even then, the nation was divided over the entry into war. Still, there were many veterans of the Civil War horrors. They still marched in our 4th of July parade. Some of them were 75 years young and upward to 85, 95, but the young ones were about 75 by that time. They had seen the horrors of war. Some had been in the battles, great battles like Gettysburg. There were families who remembered that Uncle blah, blah, blah died of yellow fever or some other febrile disease as a result of that war, because the Civil War took almost as many from disease, particularly fever, as malaria, as it did from the weapons. On the other hand are those who fought in the Spanish-American War, the 1890s, saw war as really pretty glorious. It seemed so painless. It was so easy. We defeated the Spanish so quickly. And what did we get? All kinds of wonderful things. We got Puerto Rico. We defeated the Spanish in Cuba. We took the Philippines. Didn't cost us very much. Everybody came home. The vets felt proud. And the war was a very short duration. Hey, maybe this will be the same, you know? We're going to make a lot of money. This war won't last very long. People will see that this is such a silly, stupid, irrational war. It'll probably be over within a matter of months. But those old Civil War veterans, a few were writing articles in the paper, said, well, listen, war is a pretty awful thing, and war can go on a long time, and a lot of people can die. Well, the local papers also, some people said, hey, but look at France. By September 1914, we looked on with terror and with horror at the historically unprecedented carnage. The war was centered on French soil, on the soil of France. France was an ally of us during the War for Independence. Lafayette, remember Lafayette. Remember all that France did in our deepest moments of our struggle for independence. They came over here and they fought for us and with us. Can't we do the same? So that was a strong argument for a deeper involvement. The local papers, our local newspapers, were suddenly filled, nevertheless, with press reports of the war. And soon our community was abuzz with debate. arguments in the bar and dinner tables of the Red Swan Inn and the dinner tables in homes, often centered on, should we send troops over there or just personnel? And believe me, the debate's going to go on in the weeks ahead now, because that's one of the big issues right now with fighting ISIS. Can we just do it from the air, or are we really going to have to send in our boys, our men and our women into battle on the ground? It's going to be a hot debate. It's coming up. Warwick youth seemed ready for battle, while their parents were more cautious. And grandparents, interestingly, some of them tended to support the kids. The Battle of the Marne. The Battle of the Marne was a great turning point, an early turning point in the Great War. The Battle of the Marne ran from September 6th to September 12th, 1914. It left over 300,000 casualties. And it showed the sheer, unprecedented, destructive power of the war. Now, that battle may have saved Paris from Germany, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief over that, but it changed the whole character of the war. The war then became a war of position, a war of trenches, a war of deadlock, and of massive, massive suffering. These troops would live in these ditches. When it rained, they'd be soaking wet. When it snowed, some of them would suffer frostbite and suffer from that for the rest of their lives. Then came the Battle of Verdun in February of 1916. That battle lasted 6 months. That battle led to 330,000 Germans dead, 350,000 French dead. Incredible numbers, unprecedented numbers. And then this was followed by the Battle of the Somme, which raged from July into October of 1916, with 500,000 Germans dead, 400,000 British dead, and 200,000 French. Amazing, breathtaking, horrifying. The only general consensus that seemed to prevail in Warwick at the time was that our country was, at that moment in history, grossly unprepared to participate directly in a war of such global proportions. How can we do it? We carry rifles that were designed more than 40 years ago. We don't have the tanks, we don't have airplanes, we don't even have uniforms to put on the troops that we would send over there. We just don't have the logistical capacity to do something like that, was at least the argument, possibly the rationalization for non-involvement. And in general, as I said, we accepted neutrality. Our president was Woodrow Wilson, former president of Princeton University. He was a trained historian. He said, well, you got to see both sides of all of this. You have to see the German position, you got to see the British position in French, and we need to analyze this, we need to study it, we need to do more research, I need to talk to more people and so forth. And people like Teddy Roosevelt, who had stormed up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War, said, hey, Roosevelt, he's yellow, as Teddy said. He's yellow, he's a coward. He doesn't have a plan. He's not making a decision. And Woodrow Wilson said, look, this is a serious situation. You can't rush to decisions. And look, they rushed to decisions in Europe, and that's why they've got a war going on right now. We got to take our time here. He saw really no need to enter the conflict with boots on the ground and with warships at sea. But most but not all Warwickians, if you read the local papers of the time, sympathized with the Allies and blamed Germany for the war. Many people here admired the English language, they admired English culture. English was, of course, our official language. Almost everybody in Warwick knew some English, although we had a huge immigrant population, particularly out in the Pine Island area, people who were much more comfortable speaking a European vernacular language. There are also a lot of Irish Americans living in Warwick who hated the British, of course. And then there were progressives who admired Germany. They felt that, well, look at all the social reforms that Germany is engaging in. They're leaders in social security and pensions and retirement at age 65, and they were open to labor, organized labor, and so forth. I mean, the Germans are moving forward. They're inventing great things. Even academics were quite sympathetic to Germany. They were the ones that had the University of Berlin who had introduced the seminar system of education in our country. Every person who really wanted to be taken seriously as a professor in the United States wanted to spend at least a year at one of the German universities and hopefully get their PhD in history or some other academic discipline from a German university. We also had a fair number of German Americans. In fact, a large number of German Americans, many of only the second generation here, and a lot of the first generation too, throughout Orange County, particularly over in the Newburgh area, in the eastern part of the county, but a fair number right here in Greenwood Lake. Fairly large numbers of German Americans lived around Greenwood Lake and scattered about in other parts of town. So we have to realize that not everybody was in favor of Great Britain. There were other points of view. Now, before October 1914, most thought this, as I said, would probably be a short war. Europe itself had not had a major war in more than 40 years, for nearly 2 generations. But by December 1914, with the excavation of trenches, some 400 miles long. One trench ran 400 miles, extending from the English Channel to the Swiss border. It became clear that this war isn't going to be over in a few weeks or months. They're digging in. They're digging in. And this is trench warfare, as I said before, is a war of position. The war was already, it was just a few months into the war, and a deadlock was beginning to develop. And young men were dying in the trenches. So they weren't being killed with weapons. They were dying from sitting in that stagnant water in the trenches, dying of pneumonia and all kinds of other health problems. Now, our relations with Germany did deteriorate quite quickly, and especially with German U-boat interference, submarine interference, from about February of 1915. In August of 1915, a German U-boat sank the Lusitania off the Spanish coast. 128 Americans perished on board the Lusitania. Americans were pretty damn mad over that. We saw this as a violation of our neutrality law, of international neutrality law. And Wilson public pressure forced him to ask the War Department to increase military planning and forced him to approve a large increase in the Army and the Navy in terms of personnel. Wilson did it with reluctance, just as I guess Obama's been very, very reluctant to really plunge into Syria and Iraq, to plunge back into Syria and Iraq after we've lost so many lives and spent over almost $1 trillion over there. Now to spend maybe another $1 trillion, we have to think twice about that. Well, the Warwick population, though, did continue to be quite divided. There was a continuing general aversion to getting directly involved. Somehow, can't we do this through indirect involvement? But it just didn't seem to work that way. Nevertheless, Wilson, a Democrat, got reelected in November of 1916. He defeated Charles Evans Hughes, who had built a fine reputation as our Justice of the United States Supreme Court. But Hughes wanted to go to war, and he lost the election. And some people thought, well, this was a vindication of a continuation of American neutrality. In January, in the opening of January in 1917, Woodrow Wilson, who, as I said, was just reelected, idealistically called for, quote, peace without victory. Let's have peace. Let's say no one's going to win this war, because now this is becoming a war of honor and a war of ego maintenance for a lot of the top military figures in all these countries. He said, look, let's just call it quits. This is getting out of hand. Too many people are dying. There's too much destruction. But the Europeans didn't buy that. The Europeans were not in favor of peace without victory at that point. Germany really felt that she was going to win, and so did the Triple Entente, the Allies. But then Germany began to step up its submarine warfare. It made the decision to engage in what was called unrestricted submarine warfare. And that was looking in retrospect, that was a colossal blunder. It was really a colossal blunder because it totally undermined Wilson's policy of neutrality, a strict neutrality. In fact, actually our neutrality had never really been strictly enforced, but still that was policy as an overall concept. But in February 1917, we were forced to break diplomatic relations with Germany over her increasing aggressiveness in the North Sea with her U-boats. And in March 17th, we were absolutely shocked when we picked up the newspapers here in Warwick to read that Imperial Russia had collapsed. Imperial Russia had collapsed. It was being overthrown by the Bolsheviks, the communists, the Marxists, Lenin, Trotsky, and others. And the Tsar had been arrested, and his family had been taken away, and then were brutally killed. Not just the Tsar, but his wife and his kids. What brutality! It's almost like getting your head cut off. And this also was great. It was very shocking. There was a spat of little stories and articles in our local and national regional papers about this shocking thing. And then even more shocking and more serious and disturbing, I think, was really when Germany and Russia signed a peace. Because what this meant, it then became very clear that Britain, that the Allies were probably not going to be able to win the war. And certainly the war is going to go on for a lot longer because Germany now no longer had to fight in the Eastern Front. Germany no longer had to fight a true front war. So they began to move all of their personnel, their troops and equipment to the Western Front. And it was clear that France would never be able to sustain this German onslaught. They were definitely going to need more than just simply arms. It would take more than just simply sending advisors and intelligence people over to help them out. We've got to actually send our people over there. Put them on the ground, into the trenches. And so this was a new issue that we needed to talk about and debate in our community. Only the entry of the United States could save the Allies from defeat. And Wilson, in a dramatic about-face, then broke relations, as I said, with Germany, mainly over Germany's fateful decision to engage in this unrestricted submarine warfare. In March of 1917, Germany sank 6 American ships, and that did it. Wilson had no alternative but to go before Congress on the 6th of April, 1917, and ask them for a declaration of war against the Central Powers. 50 in the House of Representatives and 6 senators voted no. Everybody else voted for war. But this war was far, far different than any war that Americans had ever fought. World War I was the first, what I would call, total war, because it was the first to demand mobilization of an entire society, of an entire economy. Everybody had to participate, and the peer pressure to do so would be enormous. But we were still terribly unprepared, and our armed forces were so small in number. But when the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia and signed that treaty with Germany, that was a real game changer for the war in the minds of most Americans. President Wilson went before the nation and he said, and I quote, "It is not an army that we must shape and train for war. It is an entire nation." Close quote. From early February 1917, Warwick woke up. The Fortnightly Club, which had been meeting fortnightly since 1894, consisted of the intelligentsia of the community, a rather elitist group of very highly educated people in town, the cognoscenti, as some people called them, would meet and would debate each fortnight. Each fortnight, someone was responsible for developing an issue and talking about it. And they would meet in each other's homes, mainly in the Hawkins house, which is that big house on the old Pine Island Turnpike that, who is it who?
Gordon?
Pardon?
The Gordon's house?
Not the Gordons. He helped Gene Beatty with our book, The Halcyon Days. Yeah, that house. That was the old Hawkins house. And many of their meetings were held there. They were held at the house, at the Stage House here in Warwick Village. And in the Tate House, he was the publisher, the advertiser. In the Ketchum House, he was the publisher of the Warwick Valley Dispatch. And there were a number of other families who also would host these. It was a wonderful group. And wouldn't you know, from really August of 1914, almost every fortnight, somebody wanted to talk about the war and how we should respond to it. And I think that most seem to, in the early period, most seem to have been opposed to U.S. troop involvement. There was a Miss Marion Pitts, the daughter of Dr. Pitts, who was a well-recognized, respected doctor in town, read a paper on that issue in February 1917. And surprisingly, a majority, they voted in the majority, were still in favor of neutrality. We can't get involved in that war. But others were beginning to undergo a big change of their position. More than ever, our youth were excited. There was a fair amount of debate going on in the Warwick Institute, which was our high school used to be called the Warwick Institute because at one time it was a private chartered high school. More than ever, our youth, though, were anxious to participate. Enlistments began to rise with news reports in our local papers that American soldiers on British ships were being taken as prisoners by Germans. Lives were clearly about to be disrupted. Larry Stage had just passed his bar exams and was looking forward to a career in law. He wanted to enlist, and I think his grandson, who was here tonight, didn't he try 5 times before he was finally accepted because they said he was too short? And he kept trying and kept trying and kept trying, and finally I guess they said, "All right, go, get out of here, you're in." And he was accepted. And then there was someone like Charles Hawkins, who was a top of his class valedictorian of Warwick Institute. He went on and graduated ultimately top of his class at Williams College. He then became a Rhodes Scholar. He went to Oxford and distinguished himself there in the field of chemistry. He was offered a job at Harvard, a professorship, one of the youngest professors ever at Harvard University, Harvard College at that time. But he turned that down. He said, "No, I want to join the Army. I want to get involved with the American Expeditionary Force." He had already become president of Oxford's so-called American Club, and he had mobilized the American Club on campus even before our involvement, in fact, from the very opening days of the war, to help grow food, to expand gardening in and around the city of Oxford, to try to raise more food to feed the British troops who were getting involved in the war. So he was a very idealistic, extremely bright young man, hugely admired by everybody in Warwick. He was a great athlete. I mean, he was just kind of the perfect person, the perfect son, and the Hawkins family were one of the most highly regarded families in our town as well. They were a farming family, but they all were college-educated people. In May of 1917, the American Expeditionary Forces, the AEF, were created. Also, a home guard, so-called home guard, was created in Warwick Village to recruit for the New York 71st Regiment. Most of the Warwick men went into the 71st New York Regiment. And it opened with a rousing speech by a soldier. Highly decorated soldier was brought down here to Warwick and to give this wonderful talk. And they invited, interestingly, all the young men and women who they considered, who people in town considered to be the most respected. The athletes, the smartest kids in school, probably the best looking, I don't know. But anyway, you know, the kids that everybody kind of admired. And they met over here at what is now the 1810 house where Michael Bertolini has his store, and that was the YMCA. And they met, and the Warwick band played some very emotional music, and this fellow walks in with all of his medals and starched shirt and khaki, and he just gave this very rousing talk and began virtually signing everybody up. Well, as soon as the captain of the football team signed up, and the captain of the baseball team, and the majorettes and so forth, I mean, the peer pressure was just enormous. And that one night, it was just incredible how many Warwick people were willing to give up their lives. I mean, it was really an amazing evening, and it was reported in the newspapers. It's just a great story. Very, very clever, though, how they were able to do that. And the first American troops arrived in Europe in June of 1917. By early June, 724 Warwick men had registered for service. The required age was, they had to be between 18 and 35. That would later be raised to 45 years of age. But most of them here were between about the age 17 and 27. John Beatty was fresh out of Yale's Sheffield School of Engineering. That's Gene Beatty May's dad. He enlisted in November 1917 in the 23rd Engineers Corps. Dozens of Red Cross girls were recruited from school and registered the eager volunteers at various registration points throughout the town. One was up in Florida at Seward, one was over in Greenwood Lake at a store, in one of the Rayner stores. There were two here in the village. There was one out in Pine Island. They're placed strategically around the town. But the local YMCA was a major site for pep rallies and for speeches. In May 1917, the United States Resource Mobilization Board was created to prepare for, would you believe, the national draft. It took a vast military census with a questionnaire of 80 questions that had to be filled out, including the question, how many people are dependent on you for your entire support? And what is your occupation? Well, the demand for soldiers exploded, and in September, the federal government instituted a national subscription. Now, unlike the Civil War, when you could pay a certain amount of money and you could get out of military service, and I must confess, my great-grandfather did that. He was a Quaker. His family said, no, you can't take up arms. So they went to various family members and raised up money so he didn't have to go off to the Civil War. But no more of that. I mean, you could be a conscientious objector, but it would be very difficult to do that, to get to be approved for that. Anyway, so we resorted to national conscription very quickly, and Warwick responded very enthusiastically. By October, the local newspapers were running a column entitled Letters from Warwick Boys. And these letters are very interesting to read, too. In World War I, 4.8 million Americans would ultimately be mobilized as servicemen. In April of 1917, our Army had only 125,000 men. So we went from 125,000 men to 4,800,000 very, very quickly. And Demarest Hall on Railroad Avenue, where, what is it, the Grappa restaurant now is located, became a major mustering place, an unofficial armory, actually, as well. And that was an appropriate place because the train would come in, the boys would go on the train, everybody would wave, the Warwick band would play music, and off the train would go toward Chester, and there went the boys. Very exciting but sad situation. The Demorest, of course, is right across from the Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad station. The war took on the aspect very quickly then of a crusade, the crusade to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, quote, the war to end all wars. Another cry was make the world safe for democracy, and let everyone have the right of self-determination. Let every peoples have the right to determine their own future. Well, the war altered nearly every aspect of the national and local economy as the emphasis on efficiency produced unprecedented centralization of economic decision-making. Mobilization extended beyond war production to the people themselves, especially in shaping their attitudes toward involvement in the war. By July 4th, 1917, the, quote, Home Guard was transformed into the Home Defense League, and the prominent Mrs. Rutherford was president of our local Red Cross, very dynamic woman. She was able to put together a very, very efficient team of young ladies, 20 of them, to work with the Red Cross. There was a huge 4th of July parade down Main Street and up Oakland Avenue to the Red Swan that year with a big, big party at the Red Swan Inn. At graduation at the Warwick Institute that year, the valedictorian spoke about patriotism to the 101 graduates of Warwick Institute. Then, July 4th, 1918, there was another huge parade down Main Street, a very big event on the lawn of the Old School Baptist Meeting House with a speech by Clifford Haight. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Haight? And he was what, superintendent of schools, I think, at that time? Haight, but much admired individual, and he was the keynote speaker. Now, I also got into the role of women and men, obviously. In October 1917, the Warwick Auxiliary of the Red Cross was shipping clothing to soldiers and also many boxes of surgical garments. From December of 1917, our local churches began to fly the flag at their front door. St. Stephen's was the first, and others followed within 2 weeks. Sarah Rutherford set up chairs in what was called the War Relief Room in the Christ Church, where clothes could be donated. They also got Sunday school classes to participate. W.B. Sayre, who lived in what is now our Bear Tavern across the street here, offered the first floor of his home to the Red Cross, and there's a picture of it here that Catherine was able to pull out of the archives of the tavern with the little flags in the window. This would also house the so-called Donut Girls, which was a new branch of the Salvation Army. Now you have to recall that we didn't declare war on Germany and directly enter that war until April of 1917. Yet we were still benefiting from very strong economic growth, and farmers were expanding their crops, and they wanted labor. They needed boys, and a lot of the farmers were saying, you know, all our able-bodied guys are going off to war. Who's going to bring in the hay? Who's going to do the corn, milk the cows, and so forth? I mean, there's some real concern about this. I mean, demands for local food was boosting agriculture. That's true, and the Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad ran through town here was shipping coal and quantities of iron. There was, from 1914 to 1919, there was no unemployment. Everybody who wanted a job would get a job, but the labor shortages were growing. And school boys of age 14 and up were asked to be, quote, farm cadets, close quote, to do volunteer work on farms because of this anticipated labor shortage. And they, as an incentive, they could get out of school. So needless to say, they responded very nicely. There were shortages of horses and donkeys, but mainly horses from our perspective. And the feds asked for us to supply horses, and Warwick did a superb job horses would regularly be unloaded at Goshen for our 71st Regiment. During the war, especially from April 1917, the federal government took measures to curb dissent and to promote public support for the war. In April of 1917, Wilson formed the Committee on Public Information, which was a propaganda agency. It would distribute patriotic literature. I have some of that literature on the table. It paid for speeches, people who would come in and speak at the Warwick Lyceum, for example, and in our schools, and would distribute patriotic literature. And there would be press releases to our local newspapers who would run in both the Dispatch and the Advertiser. The Committee on Public Information would sell the war to the American people through these speeches, through films. There's an advertisement for the first war film that was shown. Interestingly, at our Oakland Theater, the Wisner brothers opened the Oakland Theater, interestingly, within days after the outbreak of the First World War. And people piled into the Oakland Theater, particularly on Saturday afternoons, to get the newsreels of what was happening. The New York State passed a law in 1917 requiring Wilson's Declaration of War to be read in all of our schools on the 26th of April. And Miss Hyla Hasbrook, who was one of the most popular teachers in Warwick at the time and lived just across the street in what is now the Key Bank, Miss Hasbrook read it at the Warwick Institute on that day to a standing applause that lasted for more than 10 minutes. President Wilson set up an array of new federal agencies. Using the new 16th Amendment, he raised taxes on personal incomes and on corporations. He set up a food administration and placed Herbert Hoover in charge of it. He asked citizens to observe, quote, meatless and wheatless days to conserve on food and fuel. He encouraged people to plant victory gardens behind their homes and in churchyards and in schoolyards. And a whole series of posters were printed and distributed widely, mainly through the post offices for free. Posters that would say, for example, one, sow the seeds of victory, plant and raise your own vegetables. Another one said, every garden is the equivalent to a munitions plant, close quote. Well, the federal government also introduced daylight savings time for the first time. It rationed to conserve on fuel. We rationed coal and oil. We imposed gasless days when motorists could not even drive. Now, some Americans were quite concerned over the German-American population, which was over 8 million in the United States by that time. That was nearly 10% of the total U.S. population. There were also 4.5 million Irish Americans, many of whom hated the British, as I said. There was and there were growing fears of espionage. And by 1916, they were abounding. You could sense this, and again, reading our local papers, particularly the Middletown papers for some reason. The government passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918. Clearly, a certain paranoia was setting in. Right here in Warwick, too, people were very suspicious of those Germans over there in Greenwood Lake. And the Espionage Act imposed sentences of up to 20 years for anyone found guilty of aiding the enemy or in obstructing the recruitment of soldiers or in encouraging any form of disloyalty. And posters were going up around town, and the posters would read, "Spies are listening. Don't talk. Spies are everywhere." Now, how do we raise capital for this war? By late 1917, the United States government had run up huge deficits. They had to raise taxes and float bonds. In October 1918, the Liberty Bond campaign closed in late October with enormous amounts of money. Chester was first in Orange County. I don't know how that came about, but they really did a terrific job. I can't remember, it was a huge amount of money. It really kind of astounded me how much money Chester was able to raise. But Warwick didn't do too badly either. But each town actually had a quota, and Warwick was one of those towns that did quite substantially increase its quota. In fact, it was very much oversubscribed. On June 6, 1917, in that issue of the Warwick Valley Dispatch, on the front page was a list of all those who had bought Liberty Loan bonds, mainly through the Warwick National Bank, which is now the Chase Bank building on Main Street. And if your name wasn't on that list, oh boy, you were going to hear about that. And it was surprising how that list grew quite substantially in the weeks ahead. And in fact, and it was not only you could buy them through the Warwick National Bank, but through the Lehigh and Hudson River Company offices as well. So the headline was, "Is your name here? If not, get it here next week." So, and it also said, "Answer your country's call." And on the same page was also a list entitled, "Are Boys Answering Our Country's Call?" Now, it also gave the occupations, too, for some reason, of those who were buying the bonds, and their employment in civilian life. Subsequent issues printed a, quote, roll of honor, yet even in January 1919, the New York State governor appealed to everyone to buy war-saving stamps, and such stamps started to go on sale at our local post offices in December of that year. Germany launched a huge assault in Western Europe in March of 1918. By September of 1918, 896,000 American troops in great number were involved in the counterattack. It was the first time that really large numbers of American troops were sent into actual combat. This was the so-called Hindenburg Line. It was a vast system of German defenses that had been built up in northern France. And the line was finally broken by American and French and British, but mainly American, on September 29, 1918, during the 100 Days Offensive. This line was the last line of German defense on the Western Front. On October 4th, Germany asked for an armistice, and that was signed on November 11th, 1918. One of the last to die, as I've said, was Private Robert Putnam Benedict of Warwick, a very popular, highly respected young man. He had worked for George Ketchum in the Warwick Valley Dispatch, and George Ketchum, a much older man, another generation beyond him, older than him, and he maintained a very interesting correspondence from the time he told Mr. Ketchum that he was going to leave and go off to war. And it was a very emotional correspondence. Okay, so he died the last day of the war, and it shocked an awful lot of people. And he was killed by a sniper while, quote, evacuating wounded soldiers under heavy fire. Captain Madison Lewis was a bit luckier. Madison Lewis had enlisted in the war in 1917. He went off to France, and on August 18th of 1918, some of his fellow soldiers, Lilibet, was your dad, they fell into the water, didn't they? They were knocked off a bridge or something, and they were drowning. They were dying in the water, but they were under a severe gas attack, and they're all wearing gas masks. We have one over there, an original one, gas mask, and he ripped off his mask because he knew he couldn't dive into the water and save these comrades.
At that time were extremely heavy and cumbersome to get on and off. So it took a long time to get them off and take it off so he could go in the river and rescue the troops who were foundering.
And that's what Madison did, and he won, as a result of that, a Distinguished Service Cross for his heroism under fire. But Floyd Stage, your great-uncle, John? Was he your great-uncle, Floyd Stage? Your dad's brother, one of his brothers. All the Stage boys went off to war. Floyd was the first to enlist, and he was severely injured and several years later, in 1921, he fell out of his boat on Lake Warwick with his best friend. They were fishing, and something happened, but the boat overturned, and his friend was able to swim to shore, but Floyd, because of his injuries, was unable to reach the shore, and he drowned in Lake Warwick. And I think, and he was, as I said, the first Warwick person actually to volunteer after Wilson's declaration of war in April 1917. But we have to think of those people too. You know, not everybody died during the war period. Some people died years later of their injuries, and some people suffered for the rest of their lives, obviously, from their wartime injuries. And we have to remember them as well. Well, the greatest challenge and the most serious invasion that Warwick had to deal with was yet to come. This great challenge to our town did not end with the silencing of the guns and the cessation of war in October 1918 and the official end of military action the following month. We had one last great invasion, one last great battle to fight. And it wasn't in Europe. It was home. It was right here in Warwick. This was an invasion of another kind. It was an invasion of deadly pathogens. It wasn't the Great War. It was a great influenza. It was a pandemic that was a direct consequence of the war. It was brought back across the ocean in these cramped ships, brought back to our bases, our military bases. And the soldiers were coming home, and they were being decommissioned on these bases. They would have to spend a few weeks on the bases, and these became charnel houses very, very quickly. And what's interesting is that this was a disease of young people. It wasn't a disease of the elderly. The mortality rates among the elderly were really very low. It tended to hit the healthiest and the youngest, and so it hit people in their coming into their very prime of life. And between 1918 and 1920, that influenza raged around the globe in the worst pandemic recorded in human history, killing at least 50 million people and upwards. The rates, the figures keep going up now with the computerization. There's just recently someone came up with 97 million. More than 500,000 of them were Americans. It was the deadliest natural disaster probably in human history. And one of the first to die of the Great Flu in the United States Army was Private First Class Roy McCoy, who passed in early January 1918 at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. Warwick wasn't prepared for this. We were tired. We'd really been through the ringer over the last 16 months before this time. But wartime censors minimized the danger to prevent the loss of morale among our troops, because the outbreak of this occurred very early in 1918. We were really just getting involved in a big way in the European front, and we didn't want the soldiers to know how dangerous this was. And so there was a kind of self-censorship. Something like what's going on, I have to tell you right now, because I've been studying this for the last 14 years, Ebola. Ebola is much, much more serious than we are being told about. It's an extremely serious disease. We have no known cure, as we had no known cure for the great influenza. And it has the potential of becoming a pandemic. It's a virus, and because it's a virus, it mutates very quickly, as did the great influenza. When the great influenza first broke out, it was very small numbers. It seemed rather insignificant. Organizations did not respond very quickly to it. And because the response rate was very slow, as this is too, the World Health Organization is just beginning to respond. Only over the last month and a half have they really responded in a meaningful way. And with the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta too, the response has been very slow, and it's out of control. It is out of control right now. And this is what happened with the influenza. Oh, that's over in Europe. Don't worry about it. It's not going to come to the United States. It's really mild. The morbidity rates, yes, they're high, but mortality rates, oh, they aren't so bad. Well, what happened to that is in March of 1918, it mutated. It mutated. And it suddenly became very contagious. It became aerosolized. You could sneeze. It just spread very, very quickly in crowded places. But the military knew that if that got out, who's going to want to be in those trenches? Who's going to want to be anywhere where there are any other people? So it was played down, and it was also played down so the American public wouldn't panic. And because it was played down, action wasn't taken promptly. And it really spread very, very quickly. There was a young woman here in Warwick, like Charles Hawkins, one of the most popular young students in Warwick Institute. Extremely bright, beautiful. Al, she was your aunt, great aunt? And what was her name again?
Francis Buckby.
Francis Buckby. Francis Buckby had a boyfriend. He came home from base to visit one weekend, I'm told, and he was very ill. He was feverish, and he died very quickly, within a matter of days. And she got it. She got the influenza, and she died too in a matter of a few days. And that too shocked Warwick. I mean, they suddenly realized, hey, this is a terrible thing. This is not good. And on the 22nd of October, Warwick became so concerned about the spread of influenza, of this variant of influenza, that we did a radical thing. All the churches were closed. Church, Sunday, school, church services were suspended. The doors were closed. All the schools were closed. All public places were closed. Road blocks were placed in some quarantine neighborhoods in Warwick. No one was to leave. No one was to go in. The town was virtually in lockdown. Just as Freetown, Sierra Leone went into lockdown last week in response to the Ebola situation. Everything kind of stopped in Warwick. Charles Hawkins, that Rhodes Scholar, who, because he was such a brilliant chemist, was brought back to Washington and led a laboratory doing work on chemical warfare. There was an explosion in the laboratory, and he was severely injured and suffered a great deal of infection, and it compromised his immune system. But it looked like he was going to recover. But he came back to Warwick, and because his immune system was weakened, he succumbed too. Another great shock to the community. Okay, war is over. We got over the flu. More people died of the flu in Warwick than died in the war itself. More people actually died of the flu than in all the soldiers that fought in the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, and the war in Vietnam. It took that many lives. And yet most Americans today never heard of the great influenza. And it's always been incorrectly called the Spanish flu. But this is what we were dealing with. But it was conveniently forgotten. But people are going to remember it again very soon, I can guarantee you. Okay, now in 1919, a group of local veterans here formed the American Legion Post number 214. I guess, Bob, is that still? 1240, sorry. And maybe it said 214. Maybe they changed their number later.
Right. Put a 0 in front of it. It's 0214.
Oh, 0214. I see. Okay. It had 120 members at its start. Pretty substantial. And yet very little was said actually about World War I and the veterans. It was, I hate to say in the early years, it was more of a club. They had great banquets and barbecues, and they did march and parades and so forth. But I think probably the war experience was so painful that they didn't want to spend much time talking about the loss of their loved ones and things. They wanted to get on with a new life, a new chapter in their lives perhaps. But they certainly had shared common experiences of the war. In about 1938, Memorial Park was dedicated. I can't find the exact date on that, but 2,500 evergreen trees were planted at that time. The veterans would march, of course, in the 4th of July parades. The turnouts were always very good and continue to be as best they can be. In terms of government action, historically our federal government had historically been very decentralized. Now we see a major shift toward massive centralization. In December 1917, the federal government assumed control over the nation's railroads. Even our own Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad was nationalized by the government, taken over. Our U.S. Post Office assumed responsibility for operating telephone service. Warwick Valley Telephone Company came under the control of the federal government. Patriotism, strong interest in the community, a strong interest in place. People of all backgrounds came together to mobilize for that war. It really brought a lot of people together who normally wouldn't talk to each other, socialize with each other. In 1915, the Warwick Historical Society bought the old shingle house. Suddenly, history, our roots became important. People began thinking more about the past accomplishments in our community. During the war, this was a scene of many talks about the war and Warwick involvement. A committee was established to locate and mark all war veteran graves. Eventually, a plaque was made of all those who had fought in the war, who had died, and those who had survived. The issue of women's enfranchisement became a very important issue debated by the Fortnightly Club. Very strongly in favor of the enfranchisement of women. They came out very strongly in their debates on that, and that influenced people in Warwick. And the suffragette movement was very strong in Warwick in the post-World War II period. Post-World War I. World War I was the first time in American history that the U.S. had sent our soldiers abroad to defend foreign soil. Many came back with experiences. They learned about life in Paris. They learned about, different cultures. They came back more globalized, more internationally oriented in many respects. In 1919 came the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition. The Women's Temperance Union was very strong in Warwick and played a very large role in bringing about prohibition. And also the 19th Amendment. They're active in promoting the 19th Amendment, where women got the vote the following year in 1920. We saw our local politicians, particularly Hamilton Fish III, who became commander of the New York 369th Infantry Regiment, which was a regiment of African Americans. They played a very important, a very heroic role in the First World War in France with the American Expeditionary Forces. Fish developed an extremely good relationship with these African Americans, and they came to be called the Harlem Hellfighters. Dr. Renfrew M. Bradner, Sr., during the war, he and his colleague and former classmate in medical school, Dr. Bernard Krug, in 1916, as you probably know, set up Warwick's first hospital in the Servin Mansion, just behind us here in that brick building, a point of great pride, a tremendous accomplishment. That grew out of the war period, too, because they needed a place where people could be cared for, boys coming back from the war with injuries, and the whole concept of medical care and surgery and so forth began to be more important in people's minds, and they responded successfully to that. But then Bradner and Krug went off to war along with a third classmate, and Bradner became first lieutenant in the AEF in France in the medical corps. Even before it ended, he and his two classmates went off to Serbia, and they established a hospital there and a number of clinics, and began not only these clinics and hospitals, but they trained nurses' aides, Serbian nurses' aides. Serbia was terribly devastated during the First World War, and he won a gold medal from the Serbian government for that service. Bradner came back to Warwick, remained very active in the military reserves, and then In the Second War, he volunteered because he was well over age. He went back into war, went to the Philippines, distinguished himself in the medical corps there, and was awarded the Bronze Star, and then came back to Warwick. He served with the Red Cross in Serbia. In May 1938, Armistice Day was officially declared. It was made a legal holiday, I should say. November 11th would be an official holiday throughout the United States. The first commemoration of Armistice Day was on November 11th, 1919, when Wilson proclaimed it with the words, and I quote, "To us in America, the reflections of Armistice Day will be filled with solemn pride in the heroism of those who died in the country's service, and with gratitude for the victory, both because of the thing from which it has freed us and because of the opportunity it has given America to show her sympathy with peace and justice in the councils of the nations." And I think I'll close with that. Thank you very much. Whoa. Could it really be 8:30?
It is.
I wasn't looking at
Thank
my
you,
watch.
Richard.
I apologize for running
Don't.
so
It
much
was
time.
very, very
This
interesting.
is a maiden lecture, and maiden lectures are very hard to deliver because it's hard to time them.
Well, you're
But
practically...
now I know this speech is
With all
going
your
to
good
take an hour and a
friends,
half.
it's
so,
not a problem. It's
well,
not a problem, and we loved every minute of it.
Well,
And
thank you.
for all coming tonight. And if you'd like a little glass of wine, there's a glass of wine over there. And be our guests, would you?
If you just have, I'll take a few questions if you have any. I know it's getting late, so we'll just have to be very few and short. But if anyone has any question to ask, I just want to say though, I think that we can learn a lesson from this. We are going to be faced with more crises, and there's no question about it. And they're coming upon us very, very quickly, as you know. And I think we can learn a lot of lessons from how people in the past mobilized to meet crises and catastrophes. And we got through them. We survived, didn't we? So let's be optimistic. Yeah.
Is there any sense of what Warwick's reaction was to Wilson's League of Nations proposal, given their history, given our history of isolation?
It was, I haven't studied that too thoroughly, but my sense is that we were quite divided on the League of Nations. Yeah, we were. There were a lot of people who did not favor the League of Nations here, but it was an issue that didn't receive much attention in the local papers, surprisingly. Again, maybe that's because we were becoming a bit isolationist by then, by 1920, 21.
I just wanted to comment for a minute on some of the Benedict material that I gave to the society here a while ago.
And we thank you very much for that, Jim, by the way.
My father had given me this huge box. Obviously, it was a military box. It was filled with all the letters and pictures. And I was going through it at one time, and I read a lot of the letters. The lady that wrote them lived with us on our farm down in Sugarloaf. And some of the letters were stamped deceased, returned to sender. And they were never opened. And as I was going through this, I thought, you know, I'm not ready to open these. So they were in that box.
They were in that box. And I must confess, I did open a few. They're very sad, very moving.
Yeah.
That's why I get emotional about that. Again, let me return to our archives. You know, our archives are so precious to this society and should be, and I think are so precious to our community. We really have an amazing collection of information that can be so useful to so many people, sometimes don't even realize it, like companies. You know, if they want to know something about their history and maybe want to use it to advertise or whatever. I mean, there's so many opportunities for Warwick people to find useful and interesting information in our archives. And we are so fortunate that we had a woman, Florence Tate, who was my predecessor of town historian, spent her lifetime just collecting material in her house. She never married, I guess she had a little more time than most people to do this. And toward the end of her life, she lived to be quite old. You would walk through the front door and you'd virtually have to step around books and boxes and everything. I mean, just everywhere. There were just boxes of material. And it took years for a team of Warwick Historical Society members to sit down in the 1810 house in the cold, even the coldest winter months, going over all this material, thousands and thousands of papers, and trying to make sense of all this and organizing it and putting it into folders and so forth. I mean, this went on for a number of years. And then we had the good fortune, thanks to the Buckby family, to acquire this and to have a solid building where we could have an archive that was well protected and reasonably fireproof and so forth. And it continues, and more people donate material to our archive. It's ongoing all the time, and it's just great. I mean, it's really a gem for Warwick. And I maintain that Abraham Lincoln once said, "How do you know where you're going if you don't know where you've been?" How can a community have vision? How can a community look forward, plan in a forward-looking way if they don't know something about their past? And it's no surprise that Warwick, I believe, is one of the most vision-oriented communities in all of Orange County. We've led in so many areas, like in land preservation through PDR and through the Community Development Fund and so forth. I mean, we have been leaders in so many areas, hospitals and our schools, and I would maintain that it's because we have always had a very strong sense of our past. We've been proud of it, and we have looked at it and examined it, and we've been inspired and informed by that past. And that's why the Warwick Historical Society serves such an absolutely critical function to the health of our community. I mean, I can't overemphasize that. This organization gives this community backbone and strength and direction, and its people, its citizens, vision. Vision. And that's another reason why I use this as my theme tonight, because I know we're going to head into some very difficult times in the months and years ahead. And we need to pause for a moment and look back and reflect back and how did people in Warwick respond to these things in the past? And we can learn from them. So, enough advertising, proselytizing. Lily.
I just have one comment to make about my father, and that was that up until the year he died in 69, I believe, but up until 1965, he was able to wear his World War I uniform. And not only was he able to wear it, he led the parade.
He marched in every 4th of July parade that I can remember.
He was always part of it, along with Bradner's and Sanford's, and that Uncle John did too. But anyway, he led the parade in his World War I uniform.
Boy.
And you can believe it, he was very proud man.
He was indeed.
That's just a little.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. It was a real